Hi everyone, welcome to PlatformCon. My name is Manjunath Bhat and I'm a research vice president here in the software engineering practice at Gartner. In this session, I'm going to discuss how can we communicate the business value of platform engineering. This is a topic close to my heart because I've been working on software engineering all my life. In Gartner, I cover DevOps, platform engineering, cloud engineering, and these topics come up a lot. Recently, as much as the debate has been around what's it like between DevOps, is DevOps dead, is platform engineering taken over, and so on. While organizations are trying to implement platform engineering, one thing that we find that most clients struggle with is how do you communicate the true business value of platform engineering? It's fair to say that the last decade was all about organizations introducing DevOps. Now, as you can see here, this is the problem that happens when you try to scale DevOps. So, what's being depicted in this slide is that you end up with multiple teams all doing pretty much a lot of the same things. There's lots of duplication between teams, let's say, duplicating the way they build pipelines, the way they manage databases, the way they manage infrastructure, the way they manage environments. There's lots of repetitive operational toil. This is not necessarily the most efficient way to do things when you want to scale DevOps. We can liken this to the way business owners, let's say, use food trucks, right? Let's use food trucks as an analogy. So the metaphor of food trucks is business owners will really use food trucks as if it was a standalone entity where you have one multiple food trucks all managing their own sort of infrastructure, right? So you have water problems, you have supply of electricity, right? You have cooking needs and so on, and every food truck happens to be a clone in its own right. So you have replication of kitchens in each food truck. The problem statement, as you can see here, is how do we scale DevOps in such an environment? We want to enable multiple teams to build, own, and operate their own products, which is commonly called as you build it, you run it. But food trucks does not necessarily help scale this kind of operating model. The solution, what we've typically seen works, is when you create a platform engineering organizations that can externalize cross-cutting capabilities across multiple product teams. What you see here is that it's not necessarily that the platform teams take away all of the operational work from the development teams or the product teams. There's still what we would call app ops, which is there's still an element of you build it, you run it, but it's to do with the specific application that the product teams are working on. All of the underlying infrastructure complexity, the undifferentiated heavy lifting, right, automating of security and compliance needs, all of that gets subsumed within the platform team. That's what is being depicted here. And this leads to the model of shopping malls. Now, in a shopping mall, you can see, as opposed to food trucks, you have business owners that can focus on their core competency. They're able to focus on their customers, right? They're basically externalizing, in fact, outsourcing all of the non-essentials, whether it is electricity, air conditioning, and so on, to the management of the shopping mall itself. And this is a win-win both for the shopping mall as a platform, plus the business owner who manages the shop, which is the application itself. Scaling DevOps is great, but it is only part of the story. Most times we hear that platform engineering is a way of scaling DevOps, but the senior management does not necessarily understand, is scaling DevOps the true business value of platform engineering? How do we communicate the business value of platforms going beyond DevOps? We've typically heard, let's say, for instance, you could use agility as one of the business value parameters, right? What we would call value drivers of DevOps would be agility, in some cases, operational efficiency, improved security, and so on. But the problem with using very standardized cookie cutter value drivers is that it's not necessarily a one size fits all. So, in this session, what I plan to do is not give you the specific elements of what constitutes business value, but give you a framework, a model that Gartner has put together on how you should think in terms of communicating the business value. We call this the Gartner enterprise value equation. As you can see here, the enterprise value equation is broken down into two parts. Now, the upper half is about the stakeholder domain, the lower half is the enterprise domain. Also, the other two halves are on the left and right, more importantly, which is you have these two very closely intertwined curves. On the left, you have the value creation curve, which is all about we as platform engineering organizations really look at our offering in terms of the value we provide. And on the right, you see the value realization curve, which is really about both the stakeholders who receive value from the platform teams as well as the broader organizational goals that the platform teams aims to fulfill. If we look at, let's say, the specific elements of the enterprise value equation, it's fascinating to see how you can really take this in a step by step manner. The first step in applying this enterprise value equation to our platform team concept, which is basically saying, like, how can we use Gartner's enterprise value equation to communicate the business value of platform engineering specifically? We look at the first step, which is essentially to say we got to assess stakeholder priorities and concerns. And in doing so, what would be the first thing? We got to listen and sense. We got to listen to who the stakeholders are, what their needs are, and their needs could be different, right? In fact, that's the very reason this model is called the multi-factor enterprise value equation because it's not single factor. Platforms don't necessarily serve just one audience. It's not one single stakeholder. So you have multiple stakeholders. So we got to listen and sense to different needs coming from these different stakeholders. In some cases, you look at what's being shown here. So you have stakeholder priorities and concerns, which could differ based on which stakeholder you're speaking with. Say, for instance, you're speaking with a software engineering leader as the stakeholder. For them, the concern would be how do I attract top developer talent? If you're talking to maybe the chief technology officer, for them, the concern is how do we accelerate the pace of innovation? In many cases, for chief digital officers, it could be how do we build competitive differentiation? For security and risk leaders, it could be how do we ensure regulatory compliance? How do we automate security and compliance? So, depending on different stakeholder priorities, you can quickly see how your response in terms of the business value that the platform provides could be very different depending on which stakeholder needs we plan to address, which stakeholder needs we plan to prioritize first. Now, still staying on the value creation curve, the next step is to look at how we develop our options. Now, we call these value enablers. Let's break this down a bit. So, value enablers are essentially like what is the value we truly provide. Now, when I say value enablers are fundamentally in very simple terms. It's the action the platform teams take. What are we building? What are we providing as the value to the stakeholders? It's very specifically what you can see here are things like internal developer portals, internal developer platforms. You may have, in many cases, environment management tools. You could have container management platforms. In some cases, also increasingly, how do you institutionalize things like observability driven development, things like fuzz testing, chaos testing. In many cases, it's also becoming say for instance automating policy as code as much as you start moving to infrastructure as code. So all of these are what we would call value enablers, and these are this is part of a step what we call developing our options, right? Because it's not, like I said, one thing to one stakeholder. We're really trying to provide value of the platform and multiple platforms in many cases to multiple stakeholders. The next thing we do in communicating business value is how do you build a value story map? A value story is essentially a very compelling narrative. It's a narrative, but it's not just an empty narrative. The narrative is accompanied with supporting metrics, which is in many ways you can think of this. We can think of value stories as an effective tool whenever you have to communicate the business value of any initiative. In this case, we just happen to be talking about platform engineering initiatives, but it could equally apply even if you want to communicate the business value of any software engineering initiative as well. So the key elements of a value story are one, is it aligned to business objectives? Is it tailored to stakeholder priorities? Is it easy to communicate, right? Is it easy for stakeholders to digest and understand? So we got to build a value story that maps the value enablers, which is what are we building, to stakeholder impact. We have to support the value story, like I said, through metrics. But these metrics are not output driven. These metrics are outcome based. So output would typically mean like what you see on the left side, which is driven in terms of activity metrics, like how fast are we going, how many story points have we completed, what's our throughput, right? How many sprints are completed, right? Flow efficiency, all of that. What we look in terms of outcome is what we would call like optimizing for flow of value. Is the customer satisfaction improving as a result of the investment in our platform? Is our organization seeing a higher return on that investment? Is our market share growing? Right? What's the customer retention looking like? Are we able to attract good quality talent? All of these are outcome and impact metrics. So a key takeaway here is that we got to support our value story through outcome based metrics and not necessarily output driven metrics. When we do this, we also now look at mapping value enablers, so stakeholder impacts and outcomes. Now, where did we come from? We said we're going to provide value enablers. That's what are we building? We create a story map, or we build a value story to connect the value enablers to stakeholder impacts and stakeholder outcomes. We then look at what we call balancing trade-offs. Remember, I said that you're going to have multiple stakeholders, right? And these multiple stakeholders, in many cases, could also have conflicting priorities. So the need for a security and risk leader could be very different from the need for a software engineering leader. So the platform owner, the platform's engineering leader should be able to balance these trade-offs. Some examples like you see here, if you're talking to the software engineering leader, as the stakeholder, for them, maybe they come with you with a need saying we got to improve our developer experience for our development teams. The operations person, remember that platforms are not necessarily just I&O platforms. So in many cases, you could have the platform teams having a customer as also um, another team from the infrastructure and ops group, and for them, the concern could be how do I reduce operational toil, right? This is in fact also you can think of the platform team itself having to create an impact on its productivity. So reducing operational toil is in fact a benefit for the platform team itself. Right? So and also more increasingly, SREs become one of the consumers of the platform. So improving resilience could be one of their needs. The other interesting aspect of communicating business value that I've often seen is to communicate the why. And this is often lost in all of the noise. Right? We often forget to communicate the why, which is extremely important if we have to incentivize mindset shifts. Remember, it's not throwing a tool at the problem and expecting magic to happen, which is unless we bring in a mindset shift, we can't necessarily see the platform adoption growing. We can't necessarily see the platform driving business value. And you can see some very interesting examples like you see, like for instance, if you want to communicate the value of why do we need to go from enforced processes to paved roads as a concept. So we use this framework called the from, to, and because. So we say we go from enforced processes to paved roads because we have lots of infrastructure complexity. We want to minimize developer friction. We have to encourage automation because without automation it impedes our business agility. So we use from, to, because as a framework to communicate a lot of these shifts that are happening in the organizations. Many cases it could be paradigm shifts. So the more foundational, more profound the shift is, the higher the value of from, to, and because. So you see here the most, I think, if you look at the big shift in platform engineering, it's the idea of treating the platform as a product. So you can really see of one of the things I've highlighted here is how do we move from IT or infrastructure projects to treating platform as a product. So we're going from to treating platform as a product because X, Y, and Z, right? That's the framework we would use to communicate the business value and incentivize mindset shifts in across both the people producing the platform as well as the people consuming the platform. Now, overall, right, let's look at it this way. On one hand, we said there's stakeholder impact. Now, the final bit of this is that we got to now look at what's the value that the organization realizes, right? So, the final aspect of this is we have value enablers that are provided by the platform teams. We have stakeholders that derive value. That specific stakeholders could be security teams, like I said, could be SRE teams, could be software engineering teams. But it's also overall what's the value of the platform to the organization as a whole, right? So this is where the last part of this curve, which is what's the return of value to the organization itself, becomes important. And like you see specific elements called out, which is improving customer satisfaction, and for organizations, driving revenue growth becomes even more important than to a specific stakeholder, right? So time to value is extremely important from an organization perspective. So this is more, think of this as CEO level concerns, that is chief executive officer level concerns, than the individual stakeholder concerns, which could be at a business unit. Ultimately, also one of the activities that needs to happen here is look at one of the phrasing called adjust and iterate. Adjust and iterate means that this is not a once and done activity, right? We look at what's the return to the organization. In some cases we may have provided that value to the organization. In some cases we may have to fine tune the platform so that the value to the organization is much higher. Overall, I've tried to depict this slide, which provides a comprehensive view of the entire enterprise value equation and contextualize this to platform engineering. Everything from identifying specific stakeholder activities or stakeholder priorities and concerns on the left, which is what are maybe software engineering concerns, what are the value enablers, that is what work do the platform engineering teams do, what is the actions they take, what artifacts do they deliver, right? That's all on the value creation curve. On the right side, you have the value realization curve, which is what are people getting out of our platform initiatives. On the top right, you see stakeholder impact, which is as software engineering teams, they're what they will expect from the platform is to enhance develop experience for their development teams. And as an organization, what you want to really communicate is the value that you bring to the organization in terms of driving revenue growth, increased innovation, and so on. A really good example of this comes from Nike. We did a case study. It's one of my favorite case studies because it talks about the value of composable platforms. If you look at the way they've used business value to communicate the value of their platforms, it's wonderful because it, the origins of Nike's initiative was they realized, especially as they were embarking on consumer direct acceleration strategy, they quickly realized that they had a spaghetti architecture, right? As you can see here depicted, which is there was their architecture underpinnings and the technology portfolio hindered business agility. In many cases, it was enormous operational complexity that they were dealing with. It was very difficult for developers to even discover what existed. But all of these are like tech speak, right? This is not communicating business value. But pay attention to what's mentioned at the top. So Nike's highly complex landscape of thousands of systems and components slowed business agility, time to market, and innovation. This is exactly what we were talking about all along with the enterprise value equation that I just showed on the previous slide, which is using business value terms in terms of how do we reduce time to market, how do we drive greater innovation. This is exactly what Nike embarked on, right? So Nike said the value of composable platforms is not necessarily to improve like our throughput, but it's to drive innovation, it's to reduce time to market and so on. As you can see, they moved from a spaghetti architecture to a lasagna type architecture where you've created multiple foundational platforms. And this is another interesting aspect of all of the discourse going around platform engineering, saying, is this just one platform team? Is this just one platform? It's not true, right? You could have layers of platforms, and these layers of platforms are quite dynamic. It depends on who the consumer is. Remember that one of the core foundational principles of platform engineering is that platforms are demand driven. So it's not the platform teams come up with this brilliant idea saying we're going to build a platform and then figure out who's going to use it. But it's all about identifying who the consumer is, what their needs are. We got to treat the platform as if it's a product that's going to continuously evolve and iterate based on our consumer needs. That is the customer who's going to use our platform. In this case, Nike came up with three foundational layers to their platform, which is about foundational platforms, core platforms, and then experience platforms. Finally, I'm going to leave you with the three value pillars for platform teams. This is I wouldn't call this necessarily a recipe, right? So take it with a pinch of salt, but these are the common value pillars I've come across when organizations undertake a platform engineering initiative. So the value pillars are reducing time to value, or faster time to customer value, as we like to say. And this is achieved through the bullets that are listed here. So faster time to customer value is provided through self-service mechanisms that are enabled by the platform itself. As you know, platforms simplify DevOps workflows. We shorten the feedback loops, and this is extremely important. So if you look at one of the three core principles of DevOps, actually one of them, the first one is shortening feedback loops, and this implicitly improves the time to value. Improving resilience is another key value pillar, especially if you want to make reliability a key differentiator for your product itself. And I'm sure if you're treating SREs as one of the platform's consumer, for them, resilience is going to be an extremely key value pillar. The last bit is on governance. How can you embed governance? How can you build governance guardrails, that is, security and compliance guardrails into the platform itself? So, if security and risk leader are your target consumer for the platform, then pay attention to this third value pillar around governance. So, with that, this is all I had to share on how you can communicate business value of your platforms. I hope you found it useful. Happy to chat with you. If you're a Gartner client, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.